This is TWiT.
The moment you've all been waiting for.
Some people have.
This is one of the better named brown liquors.
Oh, it's got a name on it, doesn't it? Well,
I like it.
I have a bit of a preamble because I only met this whiskey this weekend because I went to the Okanagan Valley this weekend. So a very dear friend of mine invited us up, a bunch of friends of ours actually. So we all went up to stay at his place, and he lives in wine country. He's got a lovely place there. Perfect weather without a doubt. And so we did some wine tours. And so I came home with a couple of cases of wine, but we also found a local distillery and my wife had organized it. So she'd warned them that I was coming and I'm serious about my whiskey. So I got one of their very senior people for the tour. We had some really great conversations about it.
Little warning.
Just sort of set the stage for what we're talking about. The Okanagan Valley. This is between the coastal and Rocky Mountain Range in the central British Columbia. It's semi-arable desert. It's wrapped around a big lake about 75 miles long, 2 to 3 miles wide, and 700 plus feet deep. We have our own version of Loch Ness in that called Ogopogo. And there's a few good sized towns. At the north end of the lake is Vernon. The south end of the lake is Penticton, and it's roughly in the middle is Kelowna, which is about 150,000 people. It's always been a good fruit growing region. So there's a bunch of native berries, some of you probably not heard of, like the Saskatoon berry, which the Saskatchewan folks will tell you only grows in Saskatoon. It's not true. It also grows in BC, although arguably the prairie version is better. But also choke cherries, huckleberries, elderberries, which typically only known in Europe, but there are North American versions. The red ones are toxic. Don't eat them. And thimbleberries, which are as good as raspberries, but super fragile, so nobody ever ships them anywhere. The very first non-native fruit made in the Okanagan Valley was, of course, wine grapes, made by the Catholic Church in the mid-1800s to make sacrament wine, because goodness knows you can't save souls if you don't have the blood of Christ. Shortly after that, they did plant, the Catholic missionaries also planted apples, which, if you follow the lineage of apples, actually come from Kazakhstan and are only propagated by clippings. Apple trees, if you plant apple seeds, you will not get edible apples. They'll be terrible. They're normal default random apples. The genetics are so unstable. They're not very good. And so when you get a good species of apple, you graft. You take branches off and you graft it onto existing trees. I have met an apple tree that grew 30 varieties of apples all on a different branch. They got cherries by the late 1900s. Today, it's cherries, apples, peaches, apricot, plums, pears, nectarines, and of course, lots of wine grapes. Now, the Catholics planted what they call domestic grapes or Labrusca grapes, which are not the real good grapes. They're the cheap grapes, but they also grow well in North America. They were largely replaced during Prohibition. They mostly switched over to food crops, but after Prohibition, as they started getting back into grapes, there was an initial push towards what they call the French-American hybrids, grapes like Foch, which do still grow well. Quailsgate, one of the oldest wineries there, still grows a great Foch that I've drank a bunch of, but it wasn't until the 1970s that they actually got into the vinifera grapes, which are the ones you know and love, the Cab Francs, Cab Sauv, all that sort of things. And today, British Columbia, the Okanagan Valley specifically, second largest wine growing region in all of Canada, the largest being the Niagara Peninsula in Ontario. So, and just as a final aside, while I talk about wine before I get into whiskey, in 2020, in January this year, there was an unprecedented freeze in the Okanagan Valley. It went below negative 30 degrees centigrade for 3 days. It was an Arctic displacement front, so what was normally air that would be over the Arctic came down into British Columbia, and it killed every single wine bud. So literally no wine is going to grow this year. It killed a non-trivial number of the vines as well, and most of the fruit, to the point where the Fruit Processing Collective, BC Fruits Cooperative, just announced this month that it's shutting down because they don't have the funds to function, and they also don't have the fruit. This is the place where all the different orchards deliver their fruit to be stored, sorted, processed, packaged, and sold. So the entire industry is in a complete uproar. And I sat with a new friend at one of the wineries, a guy named Jesse, and we drank a lot of his wine and talked about the decimation, which is not even true because the decimation is only 1/10. This is like a 99% destruction of the fruit industry in the Okanagan, at least for a season. It's bad. But we were talking about whiskey, and my wife found there was a few distilleries in the area, and we went to this particular one, and thank goodness we got Jesse, the senior person there, who really dug in deep on how this industry came along. We started up in Vernon, which is that northern part of the Okanagan Lake, in 2004. And they started out making kirsch. There was a bumper crop in the early 2000s of sour cherries. These are the ones that typically go into fruit pies and things, not the ones you'd eat out of hand, to the point where they were rotting because they couldn't have enough market for them. And so if they're going to rot, why don't you make them into booze? And so they managed to acquire an older multifunction still. A still today they named Stilla, and ran it there and started picking up other fruit as well. They make grappa and other fruit distillates, a whole line of liqueurs that are award-winning. They eventually got into vodka and gin as well, of course, and they made a line of absinthe, which was the first real noise that they made on the marketplace because they caught the early wave of absinthe becoming a legitimate alcohol again. Absinthe's gone through an interesting ride. If you followed along on these things, it is a wine typically made from wormwood. It tastes like licorice. It
was illegal for years.
And it was, and for no good reason. This was a booze that the Egyptians have papyruses talking about making booze from wormwood.
Interesting.
But the big production of it happened in the 1800s with the Pernod family. That is today Ricard Pernod, one of the large alcoholic collectives. The main thing you got to realize about that era of booze is that you never knew what was going in the cask in terms of ABV. They didn't have specific gravity measures. And so sometimes these things came up 70, 80% alcohol and they'll make you sick. Right. And so as the abstinent movements kick in the early 1900s, they go after absinthe first. Right. There's some incidences related around it. It was, the Bohemian movement made it into some kind of hallucinogen. You saw the universe drinking this stuff, none of which
Green
is true.
Fairy and all that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so ultimately the solution to ban it without banning the rest of the booze by the temperate movement was to ban wormwood. And so that's how it kind of went off the market as a hallucinogen. Now, again, none of this actually true. Stop me if you've heard this one with a bunch of other products. It's not until the 1990s that this pushback against wormwood really comes along, and they bring it back into play. And the ban is lifted in 2005, pretty much worldwide. Not that there ever was a ban in Canada, but the folks at Okanagan Spirits jumped on board, made a version of absinthe, and made a whole show of it. I personally find this stuff dreadful, and so I don't drink it.
Yeah, it's not good.
But it was around that point in the first couple of years of operations for Okanagan Spirits that they were making money off of the fruit brandies. And then they started contracting out making whiskey. So other folks who wanted to make whiskey, they had a still to run. So they did contract whiskey for a while. And that started bringing in some real cash for them that a few years later, they were growing rapidly and the whiskey business became substantial. The challenge, of course, is that there are major whiskey producers in Canada, and the rules that govern spirit production in Canada and British Columbia are very specific to manage these ultra large companies. And so the folks at Okanagan Springs were part of a group of people that pressed the BC government to create a thing they called the craft distilling system. And really, more than anything, this was about allowing micro distilleries to function. Because making small production whiskey is expensive. And when you've got rules built around huge companies where you're taxed them very heavily, the supplier tax in British Columbia for a whiskey producer is 124%. And so it just means you can't make money on whiskey until you produce it in massive quantities, and that's hard to do. And so what they did was they said the craft rule is really about a small production place. Initially, under 50,000 liters. So that would be 65,000 bottles a year, which a big producer like Alberta Spirits produces that a day. It's 2 or 3 times that a day. But they also put some other rules in place that make these very interesting products. So if you're to qualify to be a BC craft distiller, you can only use BC products, grain, fruit, any products used in the fermentation. They have to come from British Columbia. You have to do your own fermentation and distillation. You cannot add coloring. You cannot add preservatives or any other flavors at all. You can also not add any neutral grain spirit. So it's distillate that has been aged. What do you get for following that? And you have to stay under 50,000, although today you can go up to 100,000 liters of production per year. So about 133,000 bottles per year. What do you get for staying in the craft rules? Well, the first is you're allowed to directly sell. You don't have to go through the liquor distribution board. So you can sell to licensees, you can sell to private liquor stores, and you're also exempt to the supplier markup. 100% exempt if you're under 50,000 liters, and then it's graduated. They add until you get over 100,000 liter, which one you're not a craft distiller anymore. So it's a pretty good deal. Like, for a small operation to make craft booze. So when I think about the conversation we had just a few weeks ago about folks like Rasse and Ballandock, which are also micro distilleries, little distilleries making small pints, what's happening in British Columbia here is they're protecting them from these larger business approaches so they can still tax heavily the alcohol, which is a big revenue source of the large scale things, and allow these smaller markets to grow out, possibly to be acquired into bigger companies. Like, there's choices there. But this is talking to the folks from Okanagan Spirits. They were clearly a lifestyle place. Small team of people, 6 or 8. They got 2 locations in 2014. They expanded the Vernon operation, which is their main operation. They have one of the largest column stills anywhere in North America. They call it Stillzilla. And then also opened up a facility in Kelowna, which is where we went to see Stilla, which we sat right beside. It wasn't running at the time. It was there for show, but it was a live still. It was plumbed and powered and so forth. And they make a big variety of liqueurs, but they also now make an array of whiskeys. And so a few of them, they make one they call BRBN, or bourbon, which is just corn and barley, no middle grain. Quite sweet, but definitely a bourbon. They make a true rye in the sense that it's 51% rye, which is a tough grain to work with. We've talked about this before, as well as barley. And then they have one they call one malt, which is 100% barley. The particular whiskey I'm talking about today is their current edition of the Laird of Fintry. So this is their high-end single malt product. They've made a bunch of different versions. When they first started making these back in 22, they were so rare you had to enter a lottery for the privilege of buying one. This particular one, they've finished them a bunch of different ways. They typically put them into bourbon casks for 5 years. Initially, I believe this was Jack Daniels. They sort of obliquely referred to a Tennessee bourbon. There's only a couple of choices there, but Jack is probably the most likely one. But then they often do an additional finishing stage. A few years ago, they did one in rum, and they've also done one in Quail's Gate dark wines. This particular one, which you call the BSV pipe finish. BSV actually stands for Black Sage Vineyards, which is down in the south of the Okanagan, and actually an area called Soyuz, which they call the Naramata Bench, where they make a brilliant Cab Franc, one of my favorite wines. In fact, I'm pretty sure I've fed some to Paul already. But a pipe cask is actually a variation on a style of port from Portugal. So this is a port finished whiskey. So 5 years in bourbon casks and about a year, maybe 9 months in the BSV pipes they got from Black Sage. Their particular port that Black Sage make, they actually do a mix of Cab Sav Merlot and Cab Franc. And during fermentation, once it hits a particular Brix level, where the sugar is almost gone, then they add neutral spirit to it, which is normal for a port, which immediately kills the yeast, bumps the alcohol up a level around 20% or so, and then they barrel it for 3 years in neutral oak to make their port. Common port practices makes a good port cask, which has now made this particular whiskey. So we look at the color of this. Absolutely a port finished whiskey. Like, it's got all that color for what is probably barely 6 years old. And from a noise perspective, you're still smelling a fair bit of sweet, and but no burn. It's only 42%, relatively low. And remember, they do not chill filter and they do not color. You know, one of the points that the lady we were working with for this said, we're not worried about making the same whiskey every year. Whatever happens, happens. Just enjoy it. Which is legit. It's more like wine making, right? The 24 is going to be different from the 23. It's okay. Yeah, you're going to drink that all day long. Just slides down, goes, hello, thanks for playing. You know, very easy. So a little pricey, 85 Canadian. So about $60. US, if you could find it, basically not exported. Sorry about that. You'll have to find somebody who's willing to go take the risk to shed it across the border for you, which is very difficult to do. But now that you know about craft distilling, you also know that most of that money actually goes to the distillery, not just the taxes, which to me makes me want to buy it more. Because it's a incredibly honest manifestation of a British Columbia whiskey, following some certain Scottish styles, no two ways about it, but not caught in the big alcohol machine that exists here to turn most of the stuff into our healthcare with lots of taxes. So, here I am happily poisoning myself and giving the money to the people who poisoned me.
As it should
relationship.
be. As it should be. Instead of the people trying to fix you.
Yeah, instead of the people trying to fix me. Who cares about those people, honestly? But, I had a lovely tour from those folks. The Okanagan Valley is, of course, incredibly gorgeous and great. And the time, if you're really into wine, you go there in October. This year is going to be really interesting because literally there are no native grapes this year. So all of the different wineries are scrambling to adjust, see, can we get the rules adjusted so we can buy grapes from Washington or Oregon, or would you stick strictly to Canada and buy them from the Niagara Peninsula? Like, they're all trying to figure out how to make a vintage this year because that freeze killed virtually every grape in the area. It's unbelievable. But in the meantime, we're having a sip. We found a low. Now I realize there's 60, 70 of these micro distilleries in BC because of this craft rule. Because it allows these small operations to work. And so we could be talking about different BC whiskeys for a year. Easy.
Wow. And good ones, which is nice.
So far, let's not get ahead of ourselves. This one is lovely. But you know what? You could mess up whiskey in small quantities too.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Richard Campbell, Toastmaster Extraordinaire, host at runnersradio.com and .net Rocks, and our esteemed leader when it comes to brown liquor. Thank you, Richard.
Always a pleasure. And, I love that I have an excuse. It's like, we had to do this because it's my job.
And apparently you're becoming renowned for this.
Folks are excited. I had a really good time talking to them. And it's like, every distillery guy I've met in doing this, just excited that somebody cares. That are really
I think
interested.
That's it. And I think, I'm going to guess, there are a lot of pretentious people who act like they know this stuff. And when you go in, you actually do. They feel much more appreciated. There are a lot of blowhards in this. I
think most people that show up just want a free drink or drink for cheap.
Right.
I think that's the vast majority of the folks that go in and take a tasting. It's just a thing to do, right? And maybe they're interested, maybe they're not. Certainly, there's plenty of blowhards in this space.
Oh yeah,
and certainly they were approaching me like I was one of those. And then
they realized, right?
Yeah, you take some time and you laugh about the hard parts.
Words. Yeah.
As soon as I was asking about the foaming issues around rye, the lady looks at me like, huh?
Okay. I must reassess. He's not just here for the booze.